What is going on, Governor? It's Chisgule here, and today I want to do a commander guide on Frederick the First. I have been waiting to do a guide on this commander for quite some time because I think he's got some really interesting skills, and I am so excited to do that. If you like commander guides, you should totally like and subscribe because we've got a few of the original commanders we still need to cover, and we're going to cover all the new commanders the day they come out, so a lot of good stuff to follow. We are an official creator with the Rise of Civilizations community program, and when we do a commander guide, there's a lot of things that we talk about. We talk about first the skills, because that informs everything about them. Then we talk about the talents, how to unlock, and last but not least, what are the best pairings for that commander. So with that said, let's get a look here at Frederick the First, who I think is really interesting. Now, why is Frederick the First interesting? His first skill makes it so that for the next 3 seconds, all attacks have an 80% chance to do an additional damage factor of max 800 to the target. Now, this is important to call the attention, or your attention, to the difference between direct damage factor and additional damage factor. Let me give an example of a commander that makes that distinction really clearly. Minamoto's first skill deals direct damage and additional damage. Both of those are separate types of damage, and we'll talk about how that's relevant in just a minute. Next up is a skill that does healing. Troops' normal attacks have a 10% chance to heal a portion of slightly wounded units for a max healing factor of 1000, and the effect can only trigger once every 5 seconds. This to me seems just okay. If I take a look at Pelagius, his fourth skill heals almost as much and can trigger every, well, it doesn't have a limit, it looks like. So, I don't know, this second skill on Frederick really leaves me wanting more. The third skill makes it so you do additional damage, max of 10% when attacking other player cities, and the final skill makes it so that you can bring 15% more troops to the battlefield, which, by the way, is a really big deal. The expertise skill makes it so that instead of having an 80% chance to deal additional damage factor on your primary skill, it now has a 100% chance to deal additional damage factor. So overall, what this is telling us is that we really need to exploit this additional damage factor and try to find ways to do that with the talents. And optimally, maybe we can do something that takes advantage of the fact that there's some healing here. So let's see if the talents offer anything in that front, and of course they do. They have the skill tree, the conquering tree, and the leadership tree, and before I look at those trees specifically, I want to call your attention to the fact that they have the skill tree. Now, if we look at the other commanders that have leadership and conquering, they don't have that tree. Julius Caesar has an attack tree. Hannibal has an attack tree. Scipio has an attack tree. So you can do something here with Frederick the First that you can't normally do with a commander that has leadership and conquering and this increased capacity. So let's get a look at what those details are. Now, there's 3 trees you can invest in. If you're using Frederick to attack other player cities, I do think conquering is very, very strong, largely because you can reduce the number of deaths that you have, and that is a very, very, very big deal. So I'm a huge fan of Frederick in that context. He also is countering the Watchtower, which again is a very powerful unit, but only lives in player cities. So if you are the rally leader, and there are very few players that actually are in the game, period, for your alliance, then that's the tree you should use, but most of us are not. And in that case, I would be looking at the skill tree. Why would I be looking at the skill tree? Contained within the skill tree is a lot of rage restoration, which is an engine that I can really get behind. Whenever you use a skill, you generate more rage, and that's very powerful. But this over here seems really good to me. Latent power enhancing additional skill damage by 2%. Maximum, I believe, of 6%. So I think that this is really strong. In combination with the first skill, which is all additional damage factor, and I would pick other commanders that also care about additional damage factor. That's what I would be focused in on here. So what I would do to take full advantage of this additional rage restoration is if you had the talent points to make your way all the way over to Feral Nature, but then also to use the right-hand side of the leadership tree. Now, why do I say that? The right-hand side has your March speed talents. And at this point, by the way, we're talking about an open field combat commander in Frederick the First with the skill tree, right? If you're not doing the rallies, then you're in the open field. And I love the March speed for open field, but this seems really good with the Rage Restoration. After using a skill, increase troop defense by some percentage. I believe it's a maximum of 20% for the next 2 seconds. So I like this with the Rage Restoration because it means you're using skills more frequently and you're getting the strategic prowess more frequently. The other thing I would make my way to very early is fresh recruits for the additional troop capacity. Now, the other route you could go with Frederick is to make a mixed army. And if you were doing a mixed army, you could explore these talents off to the side, armored to the teeth and armed to the teeth. You could abandon going for feral nature, but instead still pick up rejuvenate and still get latent power. I think those are very important to be picking up. Now, this top talent I don't think is very exciting because if you're the rally leader against player cities, I think you should be in the conquering tree anyways. And you shouldn't be using this commander to rally barbarians because you should be using a peacekeeper. And by barbarians, I mean like barbarian forts, and also I mean the ROK ceremony. So, with all that said, where can you find our friend Frederick the First? Frederick the First can be picked up in a number of places. You can find him in the gold keys, and you also can use your universal sculptures on him after you have obtained him. Now, the pairings here get really interesting. Hey, my friends, Chisgule from the future here, and I slept on it, and I realized I needed to edit something in here that talked about how I think you might be able to break Frederick the First and do insane amounts of damage, and I need someone to test this to confirm whether or not it's true. My friend Silent Wraith did some testing. I'll have a link to his YouTube channel in the description, but it's still unclear to me how this works. And this is going to seem really obvious after I say it out loud, but I think the way you break this first skill, which makes it sit for the next 3 seconds, all attacks have a % chance of doing additional damage to the target. I wonder if this works with area of effect attacks. So for instance, you have Barbarossa. That's how it's pronounced, right? Yes, Barbarossa. That skill goes off. And let's say you have Kusunoki or Sun Tzu or Yi Song-ye as the secondary, and they do their area of effect attack. Does that make it so you get the additional 800 damage factor on every single one of those targets? If so, oh my goodness, that's insane and powerful. Does this work with Richard I? Because he's got an AoE that hits up to 5 targets. Does this make it so that when Richard I does his AoE, every single target that's hit takes an 800 damage factor? I don't know. If you could test that, if you've got a really powered up Frederick the First, and leave a comment with some screenshots of how that works, I would love to see if that is true. And if it is, I think Frederick is very powerful. If it's not, I'm less excited about Frederick as a whole, although I think there's still some really interesting stuff you can do with him, and that is what the remainder of this video will talk about. And I go into some really good depth on that. So I'll be eager to see what testing you guys do, and I'll be looking in the comments, and I'll try to pin one that has a comprehensive analysis as to whether or not AoE as the secondary commander paired with Frederick the First primary commander actually does crazy insane amounts of damage. Very eager to see if that's true. The pairings here get really interesting because we're looking to exploit this additional damage factor. Now, it's worth mentioning that when we talk about the primary or secondary commander, the talents and skills and troop capacity all apply for the primary commander, and only the skills apply for the secondary commander. So let's talk about some of those pairings. Now, if what we want to do is exploit the additional damage factor, you could look at a commander like Minamoto, who has that additional damage factor, use him in open field, use all cavalry, so you can enjoy that cavalry attack and march speed bonus. And that additional damage factor is pretty strong here. You're going to do a lot of damage. You also could be using Minamoto as the primary, and he's got the skill tree, so you still could be picking up those same additional skill damage talents. Now, one other talent I actually didn't talk about that we need to talk about is healing herbs, which increases the healing effect by 9% at max. And that to me indicates you might want to be pairing with commanders that do some amount of healing in a perfect world. At the legendary tier, although there's no additional damage factor on Cao Cao, he does have rage restoration and healing on the fourth skill, which makes him an interesting pairing if you had Frederick the First as the primary. You could, yet again, bring all cavalry to enjoy that additional march speed and damage, and I think that would be an interesting combination to explore. Further exploiting that additional damage factor, you could use a commander like Kusunoki, who does an AoE, which would be really good in open field. You could bring all archers if you're not doing a mixed army, and Tragedy's End also does additional damage factor based on your normal attacks. That to me seems like interesting synergy. You could use Kusunoki as the primary in that configuration. Another commander that I think is kind of interesting, if you're using Frederick the First as the primary and you're going that rage restoration route, would be Pelagius. Not as much movement speed on Pelagius, instead more attack and defense. You bring all cavalry. He's got the additional damage factor, so he's getting the benefit from that. And also, he's got healing. And so this healing will be elevated. Those, I think, cover the commanders that I think are kind of interesting from the standpoint of making a unit that's in the open field, fully exploiting the additional damage factor and maybe the healing. Now, with that said, the other thing that is perhaps more worth focusing on is this troop capacity, and bringing two commanders that have very, very high troop capacity, use an army expansion, and you're going to have way more troops on the field than anybody else. In that capacity, you're looking at pairings like Julius Caesar and Scipio. Now, Julius Caesar, also very, very good for attacking cities, and if you were attacking cities with Frederick I, then you would want to use a commander like Julius Caesar, Hannibal, or Scipio as the pairing. And also, gosh, I forgot, Hannibal also has the additional troop capacity bonus as well. Not quite as much as your Caesar, but still quite high. Now, the thing that's kind of interesting about pairing with Caesar is that I would probably use Caesar as the primary and Frederick as the secondary. And I think that is because having your attack elevated might also increase your additional damage factor. I'm not 100% confident on that. So if someone knows, please do leave a comment. The thing that I really want to call your attention to when we talk about this high troop capacity is that the way you can get the most advantage from high troop capacity is by revisiting your city regularly in order to refresh the number of troops you have to heal everybody up. The reason I say that is that if you're out on the battlefield for a really long time, this skill is not doing a whole lot for you. It's giving you edge against your enemies when you actually have more troops than them. But if you stay out in the battlefield for too long, you get weak. It's no longer giving you any benefit. Does that make sense? You only have the benefit as long as you have more troops than your enemy. So go back to town, heal back up, then go back on the field, and you can enjoy being way stronger than your enemy. Now, I think Hannibal is a really interesting pairing, although this is a pay-to-play commander, because Hannibal does have some amount of healing, although I will say that this is only when you're attacking player cities. And I think this is player cities, not like all structures. Could be wrong on that. Would be eager to hear if someone actually knows for sure. I love the synergy with the healing there. And I honestly love the synergy of the troop capacity. And the thing I'll call attention to is that if you pair with Hannibal Barca, you should be using a mixed army. Now, I mentioned Scipio is also a really interesting pairing. This is because Scipio is going to be reducing the damage that you're taking. You could consider a mixed army in this situation. I would definitely have the Rage Restoration, though, and you're going in the direction of having a much more tanky unit in this case. You're not really damaging from the additional, benefiting from the additional damage factor and those related skills that you would potentially be obtaining from Frederick I, but you do have healing on Patient Warrior if you get really weak. And, the thing that I think is important to talk about with Patient Warrior, this skill, and also on Julius Caesar, Divine Julius, is that those are really, really good when you're rallying other player cities and you're reinforcing the rally constantly. Those become very good. Those are less exciting for open field. And the reason they're less exciting is that you really should be going back to town to refill your army anyways, to actually get advantage from having more troops than other people. So I think CPO is a fine pairing for doing rallies, but if you're the leader, if you're the alpha doing those rallies, you're probably pairing with a legendary that's nearly maxed out already anyways. Couple other combinations that I think are kind of interesting and worth looking at, and I guess we'll start at the legendary tier. To have a very tanky infantry unit, you could use Richard I, and that unit will have healing, will benefit tremendously from the Rage Restoration. I would use Richard as the secondary commander in that configuration. Another commander you could consider is Charles Martel, and again, going the full infantry route. I like that the shield here has a damage factor that indicates how strong the shield is, and so it's entirely possible that the skill tree talents influence the effectiveness of this shield, which would be really excellent. Now, what I find kind of fascinating is the potential pairing with El Cid and all archers. So the first skill does direct damage, which is fine. The second skill, it says here damage factor in parentheses, but down below, additional damage factor as the type of damage it's doing. I don't know which it actually is, if it's additional damage factor or regular damage factor, but if this is additional damage factor, then this is kind of a fascinating pairing. The thing that Frederick I is missing as a primary commander is mobility, and you actually get that with El Cid. I don't know. I haven't used it, couldn't say if it actually works, but I think it's kind of an interesting idea. Another pairing, if you are on the Rage Restoration plan, would be Boudica. I think it's fine, but not out of this world. She does have healing. That does have synergy with Frederick I as a primary. It works as a combo. If you really are focused on this combo, you might be using Boudica as the primary anyways, and go with the Rage Restoration in full. And I say that because she's a commander that's a whole heck of a lot easier to level up than Frederick I. Kusunoki, we've already talked about, and is kind of interesting. I think Joan of Arc is also kind of interesting in the world where you have a mixed army. You're trying to be very supportive of your allies, and there's also healing here for that synergy. Sun Tzu is kind of fascinating. I wonder if the skill damage actually has synergy with Frederick I, and it actually elevates the additional damage factor. I don't know that it does. What I do think is interesting synergy, though, is all of the Rage Restoration that you would get using Sun Tzu as the pairing. So you could go full infantry and use Sun Tzu, and I think that would be kind of interesting. Up next is Herman, and as an archer commander, you can get some pretty solid mobility from Herman. He doesn't have healing, so there's not quite as much synergy if you're using Frederick I as the primary, but I think it's still an interesting pairing. And finally, Ulji Mundok. I love that Ulji Mundok does defense reduction to the target. There is still pairing with, or I guess synergy with the skill tree, because there is damage that is done with the primary skill. You'd want to use full infantry, and you're making more of a tanky unit, in part because you want to get hit by a lot of folks so you can take advantage of strike back. Overall, I think the thing you're noticing here is that Frederick I can pair with a lot of different commanders, and that is because he's got skills that are pretty generic. They're not specific to a certain type of unit, which means you have a lot of flexibility and a lot of options. And I think it's only a matter of time, if it's not already true today, that there's going to be some way to break this additional damage factor, and I think that'll be really cool to do. Now, in terms of the order in which you max out these skills, definitely max out the first skill before proceeding any further on Frederick I. And normally I would say max out the second skill or max out the third skill before going any further. Max the first skill, keep him at 1 star, then advance him to 4 stars and unlock all of the skills, because honestly, like, these are all, I guess, equally interesting to me. Like the healing, I don't know, this is a very unexciting to me as a skill. And it honestly feels a little underpowered to me, but maybe Let's assume in a perfect world this commander is perfectly balanced. The fact that this skill seems less strong to me means that this first skill must actually be very, very good, and we just haven't figured out how to break it yet. Now, with that said, um, it's worth just elaborating a little bit on how this works. This triggers for normal attacks, and I believe also for your active skill of the secondary commander. It does not trigger for counterattacks. That's what I'm told. If it triggered for counterattacks, this would be really busted. Like, really busted for a tank unit. Like, unbelievably busted. So I don't think that's the case. But if it did work that way, it would be insane. Anyways, we've covered a lot of ground. This commander is incredibly flexible. With that said, I don't know. They're not high on my priority list because attacking cities is not high on my priorities. Instead, I've chosen to focus on barbarian hunting commanders. I've chosen to focus on city defense. And to me, those are my top priorities, and I'm really happy about that. Hopefully this guide was helpful, and if you're using Frederick I, I'd love to hear about it. Please do leave a comment, and if this was helpful, leave a comment, like, and subscribe. I'm a new content creator, so that means a lot to me. And until next time, my friends, you have fun smashing the kingdom.